The American Constitution was written in the 18th century. People seem to think it's virtuous to believe in the Constitution. People think, certainly, it's virtuous to believe in freedom of speech as it is defined by the American Constitution. And the American Constitution went on to influence the rest of the world. But the American Constitution is a relic of the 18th century. Why does it say so simply and so absolutely that the government shall make no law abridging freedom of speech? And why does it say that everyone should be able to own and carry a gun? In the 18th century, in England and the United States of America, they didn't have such a problem with defamation. They didn't have such a problem with libel laws because they had dueling. Men would fight duels over a point of honor. And that could be an insult. That could be a rumor. It could be a criticism. It could be something that one man said about another man that was perfectly reasonable and true. But nobody had to hire a lawyer. And if you weren't strong and healthy enough to fight for yourself, you could ask your older brother to do it. You could even pay a mercenary to do it. People would kill each other over minor insults. And we today take this scrap of paper, we take this sentence in the American Constitution out of its cultural and historical context, and we imagine that we can have a working society based on this simplified notion of freedom of speech without personal responsibility for what it is you've said, for what it is you've done.
And instead of describing the criticism and then proceeding to engage it and refute it, or even instead of mocking it, instead what they proceeded to do is something that has become extremely commonplace in liberal media and in liberal politics. And because it's so commonplace, we are starting to overlook how odious and pernicious and toxic and destructive and reprehensible it is. In particular, what they did was, in response to Aaron Mate's criticism, they accused Aaron, Cenk accused Aaron, of being, quote, paid by the Russians. And Anna Kasparian, in a way, went even further because she didn't even state anything definitively. She used vague innuendo to say that she believes that Aaron Mate is working for despicable dictators.
Aaron Mate lied. Aaron Mate. Everyone cares what Aaron Mate has to say, right? The guy who denies that Syrian children were killed with chemical attacks. Yeah.
And
fuck
gets
Aaron
paid by
Mate.
the.
Yeah, fuck you. Anyway, let's move on. Let's end the freaking pod. I can't.
Okay, see, that's what happened.
I can't stand that guy, and I can't stand the very intentional disinformation they put out there in regard to disgusting dictators around the world. The very people they seem to be working for, to be quite honest with you. Let's move on.
They accuse somebody, a journalist, of being paid by the Russians, even though Cenk Uygur, who made that accusation, has no evidence of any kind to support that accusation, let alone proof. He doesn't even have any grounds for reasonable suspicion that it's true, but even if he did, it wouldn't make it any justifiable because you note that he said it as fact. Aaron Mate is the guy who is paid by the Russians. He's paid by a foreign government, a foreign adversary of the United States. He's an agent of a foreign power. That's what Cenk Uygur said about Aaron Mate with no evidence. So that was on May 26th. We are now a month and a week later. They have never apologized for those comments, presented evidence for them, retracted them. It is almost impossible for people, especially heterosexual men who are most vulnerable to these kinds of tactics, to survive in liberal left politics, because at any moment anyone can accuse you of anything and no evidence is required. Scott Stringer has been in public life for 30 years. And out of the blue, someone pops up and for the first time ever accuses him of having groped her 18 years ago. She never told anybody about it, and his reputation and his candidacy is instantly destroyed. There are anonymous Twitter accounts right as we speak doing this against YouTubers and writers and commentators who are on the left or who are liberals, who are spouting opinions that people dislike, and even with no name attached to it, their reputations are getting ruined. So what Anna Kasparian did here with that little message, I've not said this about you, I've kept it to myself, but now that you're criticizing us, that's all going to change. That is grotesque. That is ethically repugnant. Fabricating accusations that someone is paid by the Russian government to discredit them and destroy their reputation, and weaponizing accusations of sexual harassment or other forms of toxicity and abuse, including against people who have never even met the supposed victim. Knowing that people are too scared to defend anybody who's accused of that, because the minute you step forward and defend somebody accused of that, you yourself get accused. When I started defending Alex Morse, when those allegations first emerged, everybody who wanted to attack Alex Morse and defend Rich Neal said, oh, Glenn Greenwald is defending Alex Morse only for one reason, because Alex Morse likes to fuck teenage boys and so does Glenn Greenwald. Everyone knows what's going to happen if you try and defend somebody who's unjustly accused with no evidence in these cases. They count on that intimidation factor. And that's what was just done to Jimmy Dore.
Culture has the potential to change politics. But with the passage of years, with the passage of decades, with the passage of centuries, it is a certainty that politics transforms the culture. Some of you have been watching this YouTube channel for many years. Some of you, welcome. It's your first time ever seeing my face or hearing my voice. People who've known me for a long time might be expecting me to offer the sort of personal reflections Glenn Greenwald just offered about ridiculous allegations that have been made against me and the terrible long-term effects they've had in my life. Still to this day, the Google search results you'll get when you put my name in, still to this day, allegations made against me by other residents living in my same apartment building who defame me, who blacken my character, and who back it up by saying, just Google his name, just look at this link on Reddit. I have to live with that forever. That's not what I have to say. What I have to say is that we're living through a transitional period in the civilization, not just the United States, not just of England, not just of the whole Western world. We're living through a transitional period on planet Earth where we have to go back and re-examine some of the most fundamental tenets, some of those fundamental assertions made in politics. And we have to let ourselves really radically reevaluate the extent to which they're bad and evil and wrong. The doctrine of freedom of speech, set down in the American Constitution, I am telling you, is fundamentally bad and evil and wrong. None of you would even raise your own children this way. You can't possibly organize a society this way. What a terrible thing to tell people as the first and only principle of freedom of speech that no law will be made to abridge it. And then how does defamation law? How do laws trying, despite this grand proclamation, trying to delimit your freedom of speech, trying to create some sense of personal responsibility for the damage done by your use of freedom of speech, how do they then creep in around the edges of that system that set down that grandiose absolute first principle that no law whatsoever will abridge your freedom of speech? Historically, those laws crept in precisely because there was a struggle to make dueling illegal. A struggle that took place on a somewhat different timeline over about 150 years in France, in Italy, in Germany, in England, and in the United States of America. It would be fair to say that between 1776 and 1876, dueling was in its final century. And it endured longer in some places than others. In Russia, for example, well into the 19th century, you've got quite a lot of dueling. There's a misconception that dueling was a luxury only enjoyed by aristocrats. No, it wasn't. It's just that there are fewer newspaper articles written about poor people killing each other over a point of honor, about peasants doing it. All right? It was a fundamental part, not just of English culture, not just of French culture. It was a fundamental part of Western civilization. And any journalist, at the dawn of the technology of the newspaper, any journalist knew that he could be called out on the street over a point of honor. And people in that culture were not ashamed to fight and die in the street. Okay. You even get a sense of this in some of the plays of Shakespeare. To us today, what a low and dirty thing to have a knife fight in the street, to have a sword fight in the street. Yes, it's the same thing. To have a gun fight in the street. We associate that with drug dealers, with poor people. But in their culture, at that time, that was the noblest thing imaginable. That was, yes, what a true aristocrat did, and a common poor tradesman, let's say, would rise to the level of an aristocrat by standing up on a point of honor and doing the same thing. All right? They worshipped that. They idealized that. That was the pinnacle of manly virtue. And if you read any primary source material from the time, it comes up again and again. I read the autobiography of a man who was in America in that early colonial period. It's not worth telling the whole story of what this book was. And he was an interesting but deeply flawed character. He was anti-slavery, but he was in favor of all kinds of other immoral things. And I remember him just saying, there will be no social progress in the United States of America until they abolish legal murder. And he had an example that he read about and talked to people about in the newspapers of that time when he was living in early independence, post-revolutionary United States of America, the first decades of the new republic. And it was a group of young men who went to an island as a logging party. So you can imagine in those days, technology was limited. You'd take a boat over, you'd stay for a couple of months cutting down trees and getting them ready to go and setting them up for a boat to carry them away. Then a boat would come back and take the wood and take the workers back also from the island. Just the cost of transportation is limited. And he said it was something like 10 men went across to the island and only 4 came back alive. Because while they were there, they had disputes with one another that they settled through duels. And some of the mothers or wives of these men who had died tried to bring a legal complaint. And the attitude of the judges, the attitude of the legal system, well, as long as there was some dispute between them, as long as they were settling a quarrel, this is perfectly fine and normal. Okay? This was a deep, profound part of Western culture. Again, none of you would raise your children this way. None of you would raise your children to say, oh, well, there can be no principle whatsoever to abridge your freedom of speech except your fear for your own life. Let's be very clear about the nature of a duel. It is not the case that duels distinguish right from wrong. An innocent man can die in a duel just as well as a guilty one, right? The nature of a duel is that it will either be decided by strength, by skill, by military prowess, or just by dumb luck. Who lives or who dies. So, 18th century America, and probably a century earlier in England, frankly. But, maybe you're talking more about 16th century England, even 15th century. Oh, yeah. You can say anything you want, but every single time you open your mouth, you're putting your life on the line. Okay? And now the centuries have gone by, and we've held on to just one little piece of that principled view of the world. A view of the world that, as I say, is fundamentally bad and evil and wrong. And we've forgotten about the rest. We've held on to the concept of personal freedom. And mysteriously, we lost our grip on the even more important concept of personal responsibility, of taking responsibility for the consequences. And let's be all the way real here. Living in fear of the consequences. If you were raising a child, or if you were writing a new Constitution today, how might the paragraph on freedom of speech begin? Couldn't it begin with a statement more like this? Couldn't it begin with a statement to the effect that you are responsible for everything you say, publicly or privately, for the rest of your life? That you are responsible for any harm that your words may do, intentionally or unintentionally. And the paragraph could go on to detail the difference between something that is said with good intentions, something that's said with bad intentions, something that's said that is true, but that damages a person's life. You might expose a secret about a person, that is true, and it might be well-intentioned, but it might ruin their careers. And saying something that is false. And then, is it intentionally false? Is it false, but you were sincerely misled by someone else telling you a falsehood? Doesn't take a genius. It doesn't take a genius to break down into a series of different columns what freedom of speech means, what being responsible for your use of freedom of speech means in the 21st century. And you know what? It meant all the same things in the 18th century. They just cope with it in a very different way. They cope with it through a culture of indescribable violence.